Let's begin.
Hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Ever had the best laid plans that just never go the way you want? Well, ever have one of those turn into a happy accident? Sometimes, evil can be rewarding beyond measure. So, dim those lights and get ready for a follow-up story to the collector, Mr. Shaw, The Locust Lake Legacy.
The woman had received a mysterious phone call that originated from a number belonging to this address, but now she stood, stopped by a gate that was locked and tied off with yellow police tape, indicating that it was a crime scene. She wore a dark-colored hooded sweatshirt to conceal herself from any eyes that may witness her presence. Tucking her hands into her pockets, she peered through the ornate bars of the iron gate, then down the large stonework wall on either side of it. Eventually, the woman was able to find a suitable place to scale the wall by climbing a tree at its edge, but before she jumped down into the garden beside the manor, she decided to test the waters by letting out a loud whistle before waiting for a moment. She wasn't stupid. She knew that a place like this had to have some kind of security, probably guard dogs, and since it was a crime scene, there was surely an officer or two patrolling the grounds. She had to be absolutely sure that she was alone before she entered this place. After what she felt was a suitable amount of time and nothing came, she decided it was safe to drop down into the garden below. She landed upon a small bed of small, pink flowers, crushing them beneath her feet before slowly sneaking toward the house. She was by no means a professional burglar, and she wasn't here to steal anything. She was here because of what she heard on the other end of the line. Heavy breathing, and the giggling of a small child. It was very odd, and she figured it was a wrong number, but it was what followed that shocked her to the core. A knocking, like wood upon wood. A rhythm that was more familiar to her than the words used to describe it. It was the tune that her father would often absently-mindedly hum while she was growing up. A rhythm that she knew better than the sound of her own beating heart, pounding within her ears. The line then abruptly cut off as the younger woman came to a realization. Her father was dead. Why was a song that he sang coming from this random house? Was she being contacted by a ghost? What was happening? She didn't have any idea of what to expect, but she knew that she had to find the source of this call, and she would use all of her remaining resources to do so if she had to. And within a short time, with a little help from some still loyal friends, she found the address to the manor that she was now slowly approaching. She hugged and moved along the hedges in the yard of the manor, where she eventually ducked behind a fountain after seeing the illumination of a flashlight passing near to her.
Did you see the aftermath of what went on here?
A young man asked. No, a slightly older man asked.
It was nuts. The whole Gilmot family. Every one of them, and their house staff. All of them gutted. Guts everywhere, man.
The young deputy said as he shined his light off into the trees that lined the road leading to the mansion. For real? The older officer replied.
Seriously, man, they were all cut up. Blood everywhere. The cook of the place was found skewered through his mouth, down through his rear end, burnt to a crisp in the oven, man. It was the craziest thing I've ever saw.
The younger officer explained in amazement. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. I can't believe that happened here. Did they catch the guy that did it? The older cop asked.
Nope. All that was left was a little girl. But you know how kids are. She didn't understand what happened. Claimed this wooden dummy did the whole thing, poor kid.
The young officer finally said as the two of them passed by the girl that remained hidden in the shadows on the opposite end of the fountain. The girl moved further along the hedges and finally up onto the stone walkway that wrapped around the side of the manor. There, she was able to find an unlocked door which allowed her to access the inside of the mansion. She found herself in a room that appeared to be some kind of library or study. Bookcases lined the walls, and there was a dark-colored wooden desk near to the window. Beside the desk was a large globe, handmade and very old. She marveled at the sheer wealth of information in the room in which she stood before she slowly opened the door to pass into the entry hall of the manor, making sure to thoroughly check for patrolling officers before she continued. The woman crept slowly through the entry hall and toward the large staircase that led to the second floor, moving past the copper elevator to make her ascent up the stairs. As she approached the stairs, she heard the sound of a door opening on the landing ahead. She could even look up to see the light of the room above on the balcony, but could see no one enter or exit, just the silhouetted light of the open door on the landing above. She moved up the stairs with caution and found herself on the second floor, where she quickly spotted an open door. She slowly moved toward the entranceway, and with her back to the wall, she turned her head to swiftly peer around the corner. What she saw made her lose her composure for a moment. It was the dummy from her father's store, the one that they had used in the ritual only a few weeks prior. The girl's name was Alexia Shaw, the only surviving member of the Shaw family, and now the leader of a fractured cult of locusts. The marionette was just sitting there, an odd smile upon its face, and sat comfortably in an old wooden rocking chair. She slowly rounded the corner to get a better look at the dummy inside. Surely this couldn't be the same dummy. She approached the marionette and suddenly stopped in her tracks with a jump of fright when she saw the puppet's head turn and stare in her direction with the same sinister smile. Alexia simply stood there, wide-eyed in shock. Surely someone had been playing a prank on her. This was all too weird, even for her.
Did you just move?
Alexia asked, not expecting to get any reply, but she did get one. The marionette stood up, as if it was still held by strings. Even though the strings had been frayed and snapped away, it still climbed to its feet, as if unseen strings were making it rise, unbending legs rising to a standing position as the dummy became fully upright. Alexia was terrified. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out, and she simply stood there, frozen with fright. She had seen things beyond any mortal understanding, but this was something different, something she could not understand. Then, suddenly, as if she should have known all along, she realized what had happened. That night a few weeks prior, she thought things had gone wrong when they performed the ritual to give her father everlasting life. She believed that it was too much for the old man, and he dropped dead on the spot. She had convinced herself that his heart gave out, and they had failed in their mission. But they didn't fail. They succeeded, albeit in a very different way than what was expected. Amadeus Shaw was indeed immortal, but he now resided within the marionette, that was present at the ritual.
Daddy?
Alexia called out in a bit of awestruck confusion. The dummy nodded its small, wooden head to confirm the girl's question. It was her father, Mr. Shaw. The girl quickly ran to embrace her father, but quickly met with the smell of smoke and the flailing of the tiny arms of the dummy. She didn't understand at first, but after the small, wooden figure pointed out her tattoo, she understood what had happened. She was a member of the cult of Locusts. Each of them were given a tattoo that represented a transition of good and evil. The ink in this tattoo was mixed with bone powder. The bone powder from the ground-up bones of the daughter of Akinifti Oniga, and the source of the curse of Locust Lake. Her father was now a locust, another monster of Locust Lake, and to her, a man become God. Then another realization dawned on her. She would never be able to hug her father again. She could not even touch him, but she figured that although it would be painful, it was better that he was alive this way than gone forever, and now nothing could ever take him away again. "Hey!" a voice said from the hallway behind Alexia. "Who's in there?" the man yelled. It was the older of the two officers that Alexia had evaded earlier.
Shit!
Alexia said, putting up her hands as the man came in with his gun drawn and ready. "Who the hell are you and what are you doing here?" the officer asked her.
I'm sorry. I'm homeless, and I was just trying to find a place to sleep. I didn't steal anything, I swear.
Alexia lied to the cop. "You hold on right there. I'm going to call for my partner and we're going to get this sorted out. If your record is clean, maybe we can let you go this time. Deal?" The officer reasoned with the younger woman.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Alexia said, unsure of what to do. "Hey, Officer Goddard, could you come in here?" the man yelled to his partner, but before another word could be said, he was yanked off his feet, firing a bullet into the ceiling in the process, before his head cracked against the edge of a wooden cabinet and his neck snapped with a sickening crunch. He was not dead yet, though, simply unable to move. He was completely paralyzed from the neck down, and he could only watch as his younger partner entered the room. The officer immediately saw his partner was down and reached for his radio to call for backup.
Officer down! Officer down! Officer Maylam is down!
The rookie cop yelled into his radio, but he too was stopped when the small marionette sliced through both of his Achilles tendons, causing his legs to collapse under the weight of his body, no longer being able to stand. The officer screamed in pain and fear, firing several gunshots at the wooden dummy, the bullets lodging into the wood before being pushed back outwards, dropping with a clanging of metal onto the floor as the holes that they had made closed up, as if nothing had ever happened. The gun was then snatched away from the officer's grasp by the small wooden figure, where it was then used to fire a single bullet through the man's right eyeball, through his brain and right out the back of his skull, causing a spurt of blood and brain matter to emerge from both his empty eye socket and the exit hole in the back of his head when the man collapsed backward, lifeless. Mr. Shaw then pointed the gun upward and brought it toward his mouth, as if to blow the smoke away from the barrel, bringing a giggle from Alexia.
We should probably get out of here,
Alexia suggested, but Mr. Shaw shook his head and raised his arm in the air before leaving the paralyzed guard on the floor, walking out into the hallway and up another flight of stairs into the third floor where Edmund Gilmont was burned up in his fireplace. This room was filled with all kinds of things, medieval artifacts, Gothic art, and essentially a complete pharmacy with various chemicals, poisons, medicines, and other things the elder Gilmont had used in a desperate attempt to prolong his life. Here, beside a small statue of a gargoyle, Alexia found an open safe, and inside, a half-dozen solid gold bars, a handful of precious gems, and a few dozen stacks of $100 bills, just a tiny taste of the fortune that was held within the manor, but more than enough to comfortably support them and to once again raise the cult of Locusts to its former glory, and hopefully beyond. Alexia found a duffel bag in a nearby closet and emptied its contents of old clothes out onto the bed before she began desperately stuffing the bag full of valuables from the safe as her father watched with that sinister, lifeless smile. Finally, toward the back of the safe, Alexia found something that was different from everything else. An old piece of parchment that was rolled up and tied off with a single piece of red ribbon. She was curious of it, so she opened it there on the spot and quickly skimmed over it, and what she glimpsed upon the very old page was something that made her eyes light up in wonder. The wrinkled page appeared to have been ripped out of some ancient book. Its edge was jagged where it was torn from its original source. The letters and images were written with some odd medium. It was brownish and kind of reddish as well, and it kind of had a musty, irony smell. The old page was bordered with the image of some weird, almost snake-like creature that had a circular mouth with fangs and a tongue that stretched and swirled around the page to bite the tail of the monster, and the tail wrapped around to meet the head of the strange beast once again, kind of like the symbol of the Ouroboros, or the world serpent eating its tail. The letters written upon the page were in some other language. Some of them even looked like they could have been hieroglyphics. It would have been completely illegible to pretty much everyone, but for some reason that she could not understand, Alexia understood the words as if they were native to her.
Was this what you wanted me to find?
Alexia asked her father. The little wooden figure simply nodded and then pointed to the door, where the sound of the front door bursting open was heard. Several officers barged into the house, guns drawn, prepared to help the officer that had radioed for help. Officer Jackson was the first to ascend the stairs, and Alexia feared what was to come when he found her there, by the corpses of his brothers in blue, on the floor next to her. The officer soon rounded the corner and found exactly that, but as soon as he stepped through and entered the room to apprehend her, Mr. Shaw dislodged a halberd from the hands of a suit of armor that stood beside the door. The axe swung downward, and the weight of it sliced through the officer's arms, causing his gun to drop to the floor, his arms still attached to it. The man screamed in pain as the stumps began to gush blood all over the room. He turned in an attempt to run, but fell over dead in the hallway, shortly thereafter, quickly bleeding out. The other officers immediately ran to the aid of Officer Jackson, who was already dead at the top of the stairs. Officer Takashi felt for a pulse on his fallen brother, but there was none. He was dead. He then motioned for the other officers to move in and follow the blood trail left by Officer Jackson. Officer Peele moved forward with his rifle up, aiming down the sights towards the room where Alexia still hid. She had ducked herself behind a shelf, leaving her father to protect her once again. The officer entered the room to find the halberd and his friend's arms on the floor beside it, still gripping his gun. There he also found a small, wooden marionette sitting beside a duffel bag, filled with stolen jewels and gold bars. "What the fuck is this?" Officer Peele said as he leaned in to inspect the stolen haul and the odd figure sitting beside it. This is when Mr. Shaw quickly smashed a gold bar against the side of the man's skull. He stumbled to the side, gripping his face, a bit stunned and confused by what had happened. His ears were ringing and his sight was blurred. He felt dizzy and nauseous. However, this all ended when Mr. Shaw delivered a second, sharp blow to the man's head, then a third, and then a fourth, pummeling in the cop's face with a bar of gold before he dropped it, bloodied, onto the floor. From there, Mr. Shaw quickly scurried out of the room, causing the other officers in the hallway to immediately open fire on him.
Stop. Hold your fire. It's just a kid,
yelled Officer Takashi, as he saw the small figure duck into another room nearby. Officers Kurosawa and Salnir slowly approached the room. They stopped before rounding the corner into the room when they heard smashing glass. Slowly, they entered the room, guns drawn, moving tactically around the corner and into the room where antique firearms were displayed. Officer Kurosawa stopped for a moment when he heard the faint clicking sound, like several small pieces of something being dropped into a metal container of some sort. Officer Salnir rounded a display shelf that held several World War I rifles and pistols, while Officer Kurosawa moved closer to the back of the room where older weapons were kept. Here, he stopped when he felt something crunching beneath his boot. He looked down to find a scattering of glass across the floor and an obviously broken display case beside him. The officer looked up from the broken display case and found a large, rounded barrel of an oddity-shaped rifle pointing directly at his head, and before he could react to what was happening, the blunderbuss fired off, launching shards of glass and broken bits of rusted metal into the man's face. He screamed in pain and fell to the floor, holding his face in his hands. Officer Salnir immediately came to his aid, and as Officer Takashi entered the room to find his severely injured fellow officer on the floor, he witnessed Officer Salnir dropping to the ground beside Kurosawa, gripping a bleeding leg that had been sliced, and the culprit that had done it scurrying away into the shadows of the adjoining room.
"What the fuck was that thing?"
yelled Salnir, in pain and shock at what had went down, gripping the back of his leg about his ankle tightly to stop the profuse bleeding of his severed Achilles tendon.
You stay here and take care of Kurosawa. I'll take care of this guy,
Takashi commanded.
"I don't think I'll be going anywhere,"
Salnir said, with a rightful attitude. Officer Takashi rounded the corner into the next room and looked around with his flashlight, his handgun drawn right next to it.
Come out and give yourself up,
the officer demanded. This room was filled with wooden and porcelain dolls. Oddly enough, it was a room where Mr. Shaw did not look out of place. The officer was on edge, and rightfully so. His friends were all either dead or injured, thanks to some unknown threat. He scanned the darkened room with the light of his flashlight and was about to leave out into the hallway when he was startled by the settling of a porcelain doll, causing him to fire off around, shattering the face of the antique doll in the crowd.
"Shit. Are you alright, Takashi?"
yelled Salnir from the other room.
Yeah.
Takashi yelled back with a laugh.
It was just a doll,
he said, and with that final word, he was struck across the head of another porcelain doll, causing it to shatter against his jaw. He immediately responded with firing several bullets into more dolls, but was soon hit across the face with another doll before the glass arms of the plaything were stuffed into his screaming mouth, causing him to choke and gag. He immediately tried to pull the invading appendages out of his throat, but Mr. Shaw simply stuffed them further downward, causing the doll's fingers to dig into the poor man's esophagus. He choked more and began to vomit in a natural attempt to dislodge the invading structure, but this only made things worse for the officer, as he also began to choke on his own vomit, completely unable to breathe. He grabbed his throat with one hand while he fired the gun off around him, trying to free himself from the death hold of a little doll on his chest, before finally the officer dropped to the ground, his eyes staring blankly into the distance, wide and bloodshot, his hands gripping his bulging neck.
"Takashi!"
yelled Salnir.
"Are you alright?"
he asked, to no reply. Officer Salnir gripped his leg and looked over to Kurosawa, who was still holding his face tightly, blood trickling between his fingers, and then he looked back at the door, where Takashi had gone. But when his eyes settled again upon the doorway, he saw a small figure in the shadows that adjoined the two rooms. The figure slowly moved toward them, rocking oddly from side to side, as if it were struggling to keep itself upright, and then it came into view in the moonlight that broke through the window of the gun room. Officer Salnier could see the face of his attacker, a grinning, wooden smile beneath a hook-like pointy nose, a wooden marionette with unblinking eyes that swayed toward him, moving on its own, with frayed strings.
What the fuck?
Salnier yelled, staring at the approaching Mr. Shaw.
What's going on, man?
Asked a blinded Kurosawa between sobs.
It's some kind of fucking doll or something.
Officer Salnier answered in shock and fear.
What?
Kurosawa asked him, confused by what he was being told, but Mr. Shaw did not allow him to give him an answer. Salnier fired a single, useless shot into the oncoming wooden figure before Mr. Shaw plunged the small blade of a pocket knife downward, thrusting it with such extreme force that it split through the thick bone of the man's forehead, lodging itself into his skull and into his brain. He simply blinked and allowed his jaw to sag open before flopping over to his side upon the floor.
Solnier?
Kurosawa asked.
Solnier, what's going on?
He asked once more. He got no answer, only a tapping on the back of the hand that was his bleeding face.
Get away.
The officer yelled.
Please stop.
He begged his unseen attacker. He was blind and could not see what was coming. Alexia entered the room shortly thereafter to find her father's wooden frame standing over the blinded officer.
Who's there?
Kurosawa asked.
Help me, please.
He cried out.
No can do.
She said.
I wish I could say I'm sorry, but I'm not.
Alexia told the man.
Something's coming and you can't stop it. No one can.
Alexia said with a smile.
What?
The officer asked, almost crying.
I'm sorry about one thing.
Alexia said.
I'm sorry you won't be around to see it.
She calmly spoke before kicking the man roughly in the face. He let out a grunting cry before she kicked him again and again, caving his skull in and leaving her free to rebuild the cult of locusts with her father. But first, there was one more thing that needed to be done. The cult wasn't entirely dead. There were still loyal members in its ranks, and their role was not done yet. Alexia contacted the first friend of the family in order to put their plan into motion. Officer Alan Scott was surprised and very much happy to hear from Alexia Shaw, the first daughter of the cult of locusts, and he was more than happy to do whatever she asked of him. His task was to delay the arrival of more police for just a few hours before he, too, would join them. Former Sheriff Gemma Hart, former Mayor Leon Smith, and former bank executive Christopher Henderson were all locked up in prison, far away, so unfortunately, they would not be joining the rest of the lucky few. Those who were found were Sarah Morton. She was the wife of the farmer who supplied food and funding for the organization. It was their job to put together emergency supplies in case of an event that left the collective in shambles, and they were forced into hiding. And it just so happened to be such a scenario that unfolded before them. Next on the list was Gwendolyn Peters, the nice, little old lady that played the organ at the nearby church. She was quite the popular and kind woman, not one to ever be suspected of being associated with a murderous cult. But now, her church's priest being found as a fellow member, she wasn't really looked at the same way. Then there was Bart Heegan, local bar owner, and he had the most important job of all, according to him anyway. He supplied the party favors whenever the organization would gather. Kelly Logan would also show up to the place. She was actually a doctor. The cult attracted those from all walks of life, and she would help keep the collective in tip-top shape. Judd Randal was seen as the town drunk, but being viewed as a drug addict, alcoholic, people usually paid him no mind, and he was allowed to go about his way. He was surprisingly perfect as a spy and messenger, if the occasion should arise. He would never say a word to anyone that didn't need to know, as long as the cult kept feeding his habits, and for a long time, they had more than enough to do that. Tobin Craig was the owner and CEO of Craig Realty Service. He sold people their homes in areas nearby. He was also pretty good with recruitment for the organization, knowing exactly who it was that sought the guidance of the cult. All of them lived within less than an hour's drive from the Gilmont estate, and all of them were extremely willing and eager to hear from Alexia and help the cult of Locusts achieve its ultimate goal. Normally, they'd have to hide their secret of life, but they had no fear of losing what they had, now that their ultimate goal was at hand. They were finally going to bring about the change in the world that they felt needed to come. One after another, all of them had arrived, much like the Gilmont family before them. Alexia instructed the first to arrive, Gwendolyn, to bring them all into a specific room. A room they would all very much enjoy to see as they discussed their final plan. They were each led into an area that held a single, large wooden table with cushioned chairs sat around it. The room was completely dark, aside from a single light that only illuminated the table and the area closely around it. The room had no windows, and they could see various things hung on the walls and other things situated around the room, but they couldn't really make out any details. Finally, when all of them had arrived and were seated, Alexia wheeled out a metal cart filled with food and drinks. She had wine from the wine cellar, and every rare and exotic gourmet food that she could find. This was to be a celebration and preparation of what was to come. Once everyone was prepared with food and beverages, Alexia walked into the shadows and retrieved the old wooden marionette that they all recognized from the ritual at the mansion. She strolled over to the end of the table and sat the doll down atop it.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow believers in the Locusts,
Alexia began.
I'm sure you are wondering why I called all of you here.
You said over the phone that our time is finally at hand. Is that true?
Gwendolyn asked with the joy of a true believer.
Yes, it's closer now than ever before,
Alexia said with a smile. What is it that you need from us, my lady? Asked the proper Tobin Gregg.
Let's have a drink and I will explain everything,
she suggested.
That sounds like a good idea to me,
exclaimed Judd.
To Alexia.
He raised his glass.
To the Locusts,
he added.
To Alexia. To the Locusts,
everyone said, raising their glasses in a toast.
Before we get started, I have one more surprise for all of you,
Alexia said, before turning and moving toward the wall to flick on the lights in the room. All four walls were stacked from floor to ceiling with murder memorabilia. Torn, bloody clothing, knives, axes, a broken pole saw, a lawnmower blade, a rusty old farming sickle. There was even a small collection of human bones that sat atop a podium at the center of the room. There were glass display cases filled with all kinds of blood and gore-covered murder weapons. The walls were nearly covered floor to ceiling with crime scene photographs pinned to the wall. It was like a shrine to murder, but not just any murder. This was a shrine to Locust Lake. The entire room gasped in slack-jawed delight. The room they sat in was filled with things that were like holy relics to them.
Oh my, Alexa. What a find,
Sarah Morton said, giving her some applause. everyone else joining in with her. Alexia waited for the praise to calm before continuing with her speech.
We are the remaining members of the Cult of Locusts. Anyone not here is either dead or in prison. We are the final 9. We are like the Aeneid gods of ancient Egypt. And just like the plague of locusts was brought down upon them, so too shall a new plague of locusts be brought down here.
She spoke with vigor and grace.
But there are only 8 of us left, my lady.
Bart Heegan interrupted. It was in that moment that the wooden marionette on the table literally sprung to life and jumped to its feet with the sound of wood thunking upon wood as its feet landed upon the table. Everyone in the room was startled by the sight. Gwendolyn even let out a little shriek of fear. The rest of the room was filled with gasps and a flurry of questions as the doll moved toward Bart and stopped directly in front of him, staring him in the eye.
What? What is this?
Kelly Logan asked in amazement, as Bart Heegan simply sat there in stunned silence.
Don't you recognize our founder?
Alexia asked.
What?
Kelly asked.
Our ritual at the mansion was not a failure. It was a success.
Alexia answered.
You mean...
Gwendolyn said, with a moment of realization.
Master Shaw?
Bart asked in a kind of confused realization. The wooden marionette simply nodded with that wicked grin upon its face.
Shall I continue?
Alexia asked. Everyone simply replied with stunned silence.
The plague of Egypt was brought by God, but the next plague will be brought by us. We seek to open the gate of Apollyon. We seek to open the mouth of Abaddon's pit. We seek the amalgamation of souls. Legion. From one, many, and from many we bring one.
What's going on?
Again interrupted, looking around, kind of confused and disoriented.
What's happening?
Gwendolyn added, unable to lift her arms from her lap.
What did you do to us?
Judd asked, most of his body completely paralyzed.
Oh, don't worry. It will be all over soon.
Alexia told them.
We need sacrifices, as many as possible for this to work.
She explained. But we were loyal through and through. You promised us immortality, Tobin exclaimed.
And you will get it in the afterlife,
Alexia informed them.
Wait, stop, please!
Bart pleaded as Mr. Shaw reached out and slashed his throat with a pocket knife, allowing his blood to gush out all over the wooden table. The room was then filled with a cacophony of screams and cries for help as Alexia and her father carried out their plan. Alexia retrieved the old lawnmower blade from the wall where it hung and lifted it over her head before driving the sharp, rusted metal down into the shoulder of Sarah Morton, thrusting it through her flesh with a fairly direct route to her heart, which easily stopped when the rusted metal cut through it. Mr. Shaw leapt from the table and retrieved a rusted old sickle from the open display case. This was then driven several times into Tobin's legs, and then several more stabs followed into his hip and side, slicing through his abdomen, allowing his innards to spill out onto the floor beside him. Alan Scott was then killed when Alexia drove a giant suture hook through his eyeball before hooking it through behind the bridge of his nose and out the other eye, piercing it through, allowing the rope to pass through his face, a rope which was then pulled forcefully downward, smashing his still screaming face off the table until he went silent. Alexia would then retrieve a mason jar filled with thumbtacks that were used to pin the crime scene photographs to the wall. She held Judd's mouth open, plugging his nose and forcing him to breathe and allow her to pour the jar of tacks down his throat. He gagged and choked and coughed up blood, struggling for air for several minutes while Alexia and Mr. Shaw took care of the others. Kelly Logan was then cut up beyond recognition when Mr. Shaw held a broken-off, rusty pole saw in hand and used it like a spear to stab the young woman repeatedly in the face until only a mushy hole remained. Gwendolyn was all that remained, and she, too, met the same fate of the others when she had her head caved in by a sledgehammer that was wielded by the tiny wooden hands of Mr. Shaw. The two of them simply looked at each other with a smile. Their plan was coming to fruition. They just needed a few more souls to open the beast's mouth, the gate to the abyss, and Locust Lake had exactly what they needed.
So it would seem that evil is all over, that terror is taking a break. Well, you'd be dead wrong. We'll return to the lake in 2 weeks, but if you can't wait that long for some more gore galore, then stop in next weekend for a nightmarish good time. And until then, remember to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.